but we'll go in a couple of different directions. We talked about the Articles of Confederation during Unit 1 being the first constitution for the independent United States. But today we're going to adopt a new law of the land, the U.S. Constitution that I guess technically we still have. So I will make a couple of arguments today as we go through the Constitution material. The first argument that I'll make today as we go through is that the Constitution is not simply a document that espouses certain high principles. I mean, there are principles sort of baked into the Constitution. But what I will be focusing on here today, as we look at the process of making the Constitution, is the role that interest played in making the Constitution. The role of interests in creating the Constitution. And what that means is that the people who made the Constitution, the people who eventually approved the Constitution, ratified the Constitution, they had certain agendas of their own. They had things that they wished to achieve. And we're going to see those kinds of conflicts play out in this process. We're talking a lot about interest. The second thing that we'll talk about is a way of understanding the Constitution generally. And I may not get through all this today. This is one of those that sometimes bleeds into a second class, and then we go from there. But I'll make an argument that the Constitution can also be considered a conservative and counter-revolutionary document, a document that violates the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. And I'll explain how you can think of it in those terms. The Declaration of Independence espoused certain principles that the Constitution ran counter to. But I'll explain that when we get to the proper point. Oh, the other thing that I meant to say, if you do need to take the test yet, because I got three people. I had a lot more, but I administratively dropped half a dozen people this morning. So we only got three people who need to take it. Be sure to see me after class. All right. So the background to what becomes the Constitutional Convention is our first topic for the day. There are certain politicians, primarily among them James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, who are recognized very early in the history of the Articles of Confederation that the Articles of Confederation are weak, as we've discussed. That the Articles of Confederation were not a suitable government for the newly independent United States. They don't have more widespread support, though, until after the events of Shays' Rebellion that we had spoken about prior to our first exam. This is the real significance of Shays' Rebellion, is that it frightens people. The rebels who followed Daniel Shays, they were not, crazy, wild-eyed, revolutionaries. They were just average farmers who didn't have to pay taxes. They were very regular folk, just like you and I. And if they get so upset that they will rise up in rebellion, maybe it doesn't bode so well for the future of the country. Probably the most important person frightened by Shays' Rebellion was George Washington. The same George Washington who had, commanded the Continental Army during the American Revolution. When the Revolution was over, he retired to his estate at Mount Vernon on the Virginia side of the Potomac River, not far from Washington, D.C., or where Washington, D.C. would eventually be. And there at Mount Vernon, George Washington engaged in the life of the gentleman farmer. He managed his estate. He didn't enslave people to do the actual work. But he's managing what's going on around his plantation, and is very content in doing so, which you've kind of read in that Judge book already. But Shays' rebellion was a cause for alarm as far as Washington was concerned. And when you have folks like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, saying, hey, we need to have a convention and talk about amending the Articles of Confederation. We need to seriously think about changing the form of government that we have now. I mean, they immediately approached George Washington. They want him there for that process. And it's a big ask of George Washington if he goes to this convention or not. Because on the one hand, if George Washington goes to this convention to change the government, amend the Articles of Confederation and so on, and that convention fails, that hurts his reputation. Because we have to understand that George Washington is this stellar, godlike figure in the history of the early United States. That he's the one true unifying force that we have all across the original 13 states. Everybody, lays claim to George Washington. He is our one legit national hero. So if the convention fails, I mean that damages his reputation. But if the convention succeeds, and we do change up our government in some way, shape, or form, what becomes of his life that he'd like to retire to at Mount Vernon? Here's a guy, he's been on the battlefield for years, and he had been out, surveying various parts of the West before that. He'd been involved in the French-Indian War. He was ready to settle down, and would rather, extract himself from public life. If he has his choice, he's left alone. But, he feels a certain sense of obligation to the country that he had helped create. So he decides to go to this convention that'll meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1787. And in so doing, he adds a lot of legitimacy to the proceedings. People might be a little leery of what's going on at this meeting in Philadelphia. What are these people up to? They might know, well, they're doing something with the government. You can look at all the big names who are there, but I don't know exactly what they're trying to do, and I don't know if we can trust them. But if George Washington's there, it's all good, because George Washington had that personal appeal. He had that panache, that level of power and trust within the people. So as our one true national figure, he shows up there, and then like, okay, it's all going to be fine. So this Constitutional Convention meets in Philadelphia in 1787. So we're, 6 years deep into the Articles of Confederation by this point. A few things that we can say about the delegates to this Constitutional Convention. All of the delegates are men. There are none who are women. And they're not a sampling of the men from across the country. This is a pretty elite group of men, the greatest men of their day, with experience in government, large property holdings. Most of them do own land. A third of them are college educated, which would have been a pretty substantial portion of them at the time. 19 of them were slave owners, which is going to play a large role when we talk about later today. They had an average age of 42, the youngest delegate 27, the oldest 81, Benjamin Franklin, but the average age of 42. About the only noteworthy figure absent from the Constitutional Convention at the time was Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson was serving overseas as our ambassador to France at the time. So he was not there, but among all the other kind of big names from that time period, they're all present. So right away, when this convention meets, there are certain points of agreement that we can admit, didn't cause any kind of problem. First of all, that they agreed, yes, well, we'll name George Washington the president of this convention. That, again, is a smart move for legitimacy purposes. Washington is there, let's make him the nominal head of the convention. They all agree with that. They also agreed that the meetings of this convention would be held in secret. That they don't want a lot of rumor, they don't want, bits and pieces of their conversations spilling out into the streets and, taking on lives of their own as the public talks about it. They're also not really interested in the input of the masses of the people outside either, because again, this is a pretty educated, elite group of people. They think themselves to be really in the best position to make whatever changes to this government as they need. They have that level of hubris, you might say, that they are the experts, they are the ones who will figure this out. So, for the entire summer, from May until September, they end up holding these meetings in secret. The doors are shut, the windows are shut, it's sealed off, the room that they are in. And they're doing this during the hottest time of the year in Philadelphia. I mean, I've lived close to Philadelphia for a couple of years. And yeah, it doesn't get as hot there as it does here. I mean, we are in the devil's butthole here in Southeast Texas. But it still gets pretty hot and humid in Philadelphia as well. So they're sitting in this room just sweating because they don't have, so much as an electric fan, much less central AC. And they're spending months just arguing about what government should look like. It would have been just a horrible, horrible place to be. So, what else do they agree on? They agree that, yes, we do need a stronger central government, that the Articles of Confederation are not adequate, that we need to strengthen this central government. Now, they don't necessarily agree how much stronger it should be, but there is agreement we do need a stronger central government. That we should have government by consent of the governed, that we should have, a representative government. And that, and this is sort of a realization here born of the critical period. They've made the realization that power by its nature is subject to abuse. They've seen what happened during the critical period, especially at like the state government level. They realized that ideal of the virtuous statesman, the idea that we need to elect public officials who look after the common good rather than their own self-interests, those are hard people to come by. That we're electing to office selfish and interested people. And that's just the way it is. People, bring baggage into office. They have personal agendas. And they are going to follow through on that once they are in office. We cannot count on office holders to do the right thing for us. We can more likely count on them to do the right thing for themselves. And we have this founding generation, they're recognizing this in 1787. So that they need to come up with a government that is designed to manage and restrain the basest impulses of people. There's so much I want to say about what's going on now versus what I'm telling you right now, but this is not my job. I'll stick with the history, and you can fill in the blanks. If we have people who are interested, if they have agendas of their own, the founders are saying we have to be careful about the dangers of faction. Now, a faction, they would say, is just a group of people. A faction might be large, it might be small. Size doesn't matter really. You can have a faction of different sizes. But what the faction does, a faction has a shared set of interests that they would like to pursue. And what these factions would like to do is gain control of government so that they might implement their agenda. This is the idea of a faction. A group of people, maybe large or small, that wants to seize control of government to pursue its own interests. What would we call that today? A political party, yes, exactly. In 1787, we didn't have political parties. And there's not really a concept of political party yet. We'll see that next week. In 1787, the founding generation spoke of what we would call political parties as these dangerous factions. Because again, factions don't look out for the good of everyone, they look out for the good of themselves. So, one of the real challenges here, having this realization born of the critical period, was to come up with a government that can deal with the way people are. It's as James Madison said, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary. If all men were angels, no government would be necessary. But, we're not all angels, so we do need government. What should this government look like is the big fundamental question. Questions so far? Before we move on with the narrative. All right. So there's two basic proposals that emerge pretty quickly when this convention that becomes known as the Constitutional Convention begins to meet. On the one hand, you have the proposed New Jersey plan put forth by a delegate from New Jersey. The New Jersey plan represents the views of the smaller states. And when I say smaller states here, I'm not necessarily talking about geographic size. I'm talking about states smaller in population. States smaller in population. So the states smaller in population, like a New Jersey or a Delaware or what have you, they call for nothing more than a revised Articles of Confederation. Even proponents of the New Jersey plan say, yes, the Articles of Confederation are too weak. We do need to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. But, we can find ways to do that, but still keep the Articles in place. We can make sure that Congress would have the ability to impose taxes, for instance. They'll acknowledge that kind of need. But at the same time, you're keeping the Articles, you're just, tweaking them. And you are maintaining this loose confederation of states that we described last week. So that's the one overall approach, the slight change version. The other proposal that emerges right off the bat is James Madison's Virginia plan. And this is the proposal favored by Virginia and other larger states, the states larger in population, like Virginia, like New York, et cetera, et cetera. Madison says in his Virginia plan that what we really need to do is jettison the Articles of Confederation altogether. Let's abandon the Articles, grab them, crinkle them up, toss them in the trash, start over, start from scratch. We're going to build a fresh government from the ground up. That there is nothing redeemable in the Articles of Confederation to build off of. Let's just go ahead and start a brand new government, one that has a much stronger central government than the Articles of Confederation that it would be replacing. And it doesn't take too long before you can see that the general thrust of sentiment is to adopt the Virginia plan. Or at least use that, I should be careful there, to use the Virginia plan as the basis for discussion moving forward. That's the more careful, measured way to say what I'm saying. The Virginia plan becomes the basis for discussion. And as a consequence, James Madison eventually gets labeled father of the Constitution. Be careful there. George Washington is the president of the convention, but it's James Madison who becomes ultimately the father of the Constitution. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty, the points of disagreement among those delegates gathered there in the room. One big point of disagreement concerned geography and the nature of representation. Again, we're going to see, interests at work. The smaller states, the states smaller in population, they insist upon the principle that, we have a Congress in which each state gets an equal vote. That's what we actually had under the Articles of Confederation already. They want to keep that because the small states argue that it doesn't matter, how many people a state has, that, New Jersey is every bit as important as New York or Virginia. That Delaware is as important as North Carolina or South Carolina. That no state should get to be superior to another in this government that we would be creating. So that seems like a fairly logical argument, right? There's a certain level of fairness there that the small states are arguing for. that all states should be considered the equal to the other states, that no state is superior to another. It's on that principle that they say each state should have an equal share of the vote. But now you have also the interests of the large states. And the large states make a different argument. They say, you know, the states like Virginia and New York especially, well, representation should be based on population. Representation should be based upon the numbers of people living in that state. Because, you know, each representative in this government that we're creating should only have to represent, you know, like X number of people. You could have, in a large state, the one representative representing way more individual people than the one representative in Congress from a smaller state. And they're like, well, that's not good either, because we have to have people in government who are listening to their constituents. And if there's too many people, they're not going to be able to hear them. So we should really have representation based on population, the number of states, the number of people that live in those states. And I mean, there's a logic to that too, right? That also makes sense. So in fact, in the Virginia plan proposed 2 houses of Congress, and in both houses of Congress, representation would be based on population, because that represents the interest of the larger states. So that's one of the issues. We'll see how these are resolved here in just a second. Another of the big points of disagreement. What about the issue of slavery? This is going to pop up quite a bit. We'll deal with a couple of questions now. If in fact population would have some relationship to representation, how do you count enslaved people? And here we can see interest very much at work. Delegates from the North would say, well, no, you don't count slaves in determining representation. Because, as these Northern delegates said, slaves were property. Slaves were property. And that if property in slaves can be used to determine representation in Congress, well, what about the North's agricultural property? Do we get to count our pigs and chickens and cows? You'll note the exact opposite argument is coming from the South. The South would say, well, of course you count enslaved people in representation. Because, you know, hey, they're people too. Which is wild, because of course, they're people and property. This is the fundamental disjuncture, you know, bound up in enslaved people, is that they are both people and property. And the South is actually recognizing the peoplehood, the personhood. The North is emphasizing the property component. But note here, slaves made up about 3% of the population in the North. They made up about 35% of the population of the South. So the North is going to get basically no benefit if slaves are counted in terms of representation. All of that benefit would devolve upon the South. The South could get 35% more representation in Congress if slaves were counted as part of that tally. The situation kind of reverses itself when we ask the question, how are slaves to be counted in terms of taxation? Taxation at the time was based on property. So the North said, well, of course you count slaves in terms of taxation. That's not going to affect the North at all, hardly. Again, interest being at stake here. And the South would say, well, no, you don't count slaves in terms of taxation because they're people. And we don't have like an income tax based on people. Our taxation policy is based on property. So, in these examples here, the South, again, recognizing the personhood of the slave, the North more focusing on the property aspect. But the two regions, in both cases, adopt a position that will be most beneficial to them and their particular region. Again, interests, slave-owned versus non-slave-owned in this case. Questions so far?
What was the population percentage between the two in the North and South?
3% of the northern population was enslaved. 35% of the southern population was enslaved. So the South has basically like 12 times the number of enslaved people that the North has. So that's the big difference we're talking about. So these points of disagreement, the nature of representation, large states and small states, these issues of slavery, counting them in terms of representation and taxation. These issues drag on and on for a period of several months. We finally have a breakthrough in July. So they've been talking about this stuff for a couple of months. It had been a very frustrating time, but finally we have a compromise.